Bronya is a 5-star harmony unit in Honkai starrail and is the most sought after character from the standard supply. Due to her insane offensive buffs and team building flexibility, she's widely considered one of the most valuable units you can get for your account. So if you want to understand her full potential, stick around, as in this video I'll explain everything you need to know about Bronya, including her talents, traces, and eidolons, her optimal builds, and lastly, how to use her on a team. Hopefully by the end of this video, you will understand why people are spending hours re-rolling for Bronya. Starting off with the ability she's most known for, Combat Redeployment removes a debuff from the ally's targeting, immediately has them take a turn, and increases their damage by 39% at level 3, up to a whopping 75.9% at level 13. This skill is incredibly valuable, as you can give any character in your team an early or extra turn, regardless of their status, allowing you to adapt to almost any situation in the fight. Need to break the toughness bar? Make your DPS go again. Your tank is too slow? Move them up the stack. Your ally needs energy for another ultimate? Have them take another turn. Speaking of ultimates, one thing to note is that while this buff lasts for only one turn, ultimates don't count as using your turn, allowing you to use Bronya's skill, use your character's ultimate, and then have your ally take their turn with the damage buff still applied. This skill also effectively raises the damage ceiling and floor of any ally in your team, giving characters like Sere more potential to kill an enemy to trigger her talent. You can even use the skill on yourself, but don't do that because she can't take action right after. Next, let's talk about her basic attack. While on its own, her basic attack isn't significant. However, it's important to note her Ascension 2 trace, Command, which increases her basic attack's crit rate to 100%. And as if having a 100% crit rate isn't enough, her talent, Leading the Way, forward advances her actions after using her basic attack, meaning that under the right conditions, she can act again before the enemy even gets a chance. With these two passes in mind, you might be able to see how she is still insanely useful even when she isn't using her skill. While most supports don't generate much value for the team with her basic attacks, Bronya is able to effectively generate energy for herself and skill points for the team, all while dealing a decent amount of HP and toughness damage due to her crit rate and frequency of attacks. Also, because she crits 100% of the time, you can focus on rolling crit damage on her relics to further increase her damage potential. Building crit damage also serves another purpose, which I'll cover when we go over her ultimate. One important thing to know, however, is that critical strikes do not do more damage to the toughness bar. Also, because we don't build attack on Bronya, the damage from her critical strikes will matter less and less as you attempt more challenging content. However, considering physical DPS Xiangling was the meta early in Genshin's life, which is drastically different from how she's built today, who knows, maybe building attack Bronya will be the next meta months from now. If that ends up happening, I'll be sure to cover it, so subscribe to my channel so you won't miss my future guide about it. And now let's talk about her ultimate. The Belobog March is a 2-turn party-wide buff, giving a percent attack increase and a crit damage buff which scales with Bronya's own crit damage stat. The damage potential this ultimate offers is one of a kind, and combining your ultimate with your skill while your ally has their ultimate is just one common way to basically wipe an enemy wave. Not only is it an amazing buff for your allies, because it also gives Bronya the crit damage buff, it synergizes well with her A2 passive, meaning that it's worth using even when it's Bronya's turn. This ultimate is also used for supports like Tingyuing, whose buff scales off her own attack. And finally, we have Bronya's technique, which increases your party's attack by 15% for 2 turns, because we clearly need more attack buffs. By the way, free tip for those that didn't know, you can stack this and multiple other non-attack techniques right before a fight. To briefly touch on her other traces, her A4 trace increases her ally's defense for 2 turns at the start of the battle, and her A6 trace gives a permanent 10% damage buff to the whole team. Ideally, you'll get all of Bronya's Ascension traces, but in regards to leveling her abilities, prioritize her talent as you'll be using her base attack a lot, and then her skill and ultimate with basic attack being optional. For her sub nodes, prioritize crit damage and then effect resistance with wind damage being optional. And finally, let's briefly go over her eidolons. Her E1 that gives her a 50% chance of recovering a skill point after using your skill, and considering that combo with Bronya's skill costs 2 skill points, 1 point for Bronya and 1 point for your ally, this passive is incredibly useful for maintaining your resources. Next, her E2 increases your target ally's speed by 30% after they take an action, which can potentially give your ally an earlier turn while having some synergy with speed scaling characters like Sere. Next is her E4, which is potentially her strongest eidolon, where she will do a follow-up attack when her ally uses a basic attack on the enemy with wind weakness, giving yet another method of energy generation for Bronya. And finally, we have her E6, which makes a damage boost from her skill last for an additional turn. Now, of course, you don't need any of Bronya's eidolons to function, and considering that you can only guarantee Bronya once after 300 pulls, I cannot recommend going for these unless she has her own banner down the line. And, unless you're Dawei himself, you should never spend Jade on the standard banner. Now that we've covered all Bronya's abilities, let's go over how you're going to build her. Seeing that one of Bronya's primary roles is to spam her ultimate as often as possible, we should focus on relics that take full advantage of that. So for our optimal relic set, I recommend the Eagle Twilight line, as the 4-piece effect advances the wearer's actions by 25% after using their ultimate. And since Bronya wants to be spamming her ultimate, the 4-piece effect will often give her an earlier turn. An alternative relic set I recommend is one that can be more commonly obtained in the early game. Musketeer Wild Wheat is also a decent choice for the 6% speed increase in the 4-piece set bonus. For her planner ornament set, you have 2 options. The first option being the Fleet of the Ageless, as its set bonus gives Bronya more survivability and more attack for her allies. For a spicier option, you can also try Sprightly Von Walk, as the 2-piece set gives more energy regeneration and will almost guarantee that a Bronya with enough speed will go first in battles, allowing you to survey the stack and make decisions before your opponent can act. As of now, I recommend Fleet of the Ageless for general use, as considering that you will have at least one unit in the party that scales off attack, this set is good for all situations. However, in the case of Sprightly Von Walk, it is important to consider how strong turn manipulation is for a game like Starrail. Seeing that some enemies in the game already have an insane amount of speed, like the Automaton Direwolf and the Decaying Shadow, being able to go before they can cast their buffs and game-limiting mechanics is a strategy to consider. And seeing that the best way to limit a player in a turn-based game is to prevent them from even using their units, it's possible that MiHoYo may release more enemies with insane debuffing mechanics in the future. With that in mind, having multiple supports on a team with the set, with Bronya's turn manipulating ability, is, in my opinion, something worth thinking about in regards to Honkai's future content. Now for the Relic main stats, starting with the body, I recommend crit damage to buff her ultimate. For the shoes, I strongly recommend speed. For your planar sphere, I recommend getting wind damage. And finally for the link rope, you should get energy regeneration. For the Relic substats, prioritize speed, then crit damage, and then finally effect resistance. Before wrapping this section up, I need to emphasize how important it is to get as much speed as possible on Bronya, as using her basic attack often is essential to her rotation, something we'll go over later in this video. In fact, speed is so essential to Bronya that even if your other substat rolls are not ideal, if there's a lot of speed on a relic, you should give it to her anyways. Moving on, let's talk about the best Lightcone options for Bronya. I'll be separating each Lightcone by rarity with some thoughts and considerations about each Lightcone. Starting off with the 5-star option, the only 5-star Harmony Lightcone in the game. But the battle isn't over. Bronya's signature Lightcone can be purchased from the store for 600 Starlight, making this sort of a free-to-play Lightcone, as you can eventually save up enough over time. This Lightcone increases the wearer's energy regeneration rate and gives 1 skill point after the wearer uses their ultimate on an ally. Additionally, if the wearer uses their skill, the next ally taking action will deal an additional % of damage. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, Bronya's goal is to generate energy and skill points from her attack, weaving her skill based on the situation, and use her ultimate as often as possible. This Lightcone checks off all those boxes, as the energy regen not only applies when she uses her attack and skill, it also applies when Bronya gets hit in fights, which will happen a lot more than you'd probably like. And despite the 2 ultimate requirement to get a skill point, Bronya is absolutely going to use her ultimate at least twice in most engagements. This is the best Lightcone in general for Bronya, as each effect is obviously synergistic with her role as a support. Next, we have the 4 stars, where we have 4 possible options. Starting out with my most recommended Lightcone in this section, Memories of the Past, Bronya's 4-star signature Lightcone increases the wearer's break effect and additionally regenerates them energy whenever they attack. Now in regards to break effect, keep in mind that it is not the damage you do to the toughness bar, but instead the damage you do when you break it. With this in mind, the break effect of the Lightcone is not particularly useful to the character against enemies with high toughness. However, the energy regeneration gained from basic attacks is very strong, as it still shortens the time between her ultimates. Next we have the Lightcone Past and Future, which is available in the Forgotten Hollow shop. After the wearer uses her skill, the next ally taking action will deal increased damage. This Lightcone's effect is basically a weaker version of the last part of Bronya's 5-star Lightcone, and while it doesn't provide the energy that Bronya needs for her ultimates, it does synergize well with her skill. Next we have Dance Dance Dance, which advances forward your allies' actions after the wearer uses their ultimate. This Lightcone is most interesting to me, as giving yourself and your allies an earlier turn is always good, but combining this with the 4-piece bonus from the Eagle of Twilight line will basically guarantee Bronya will go before the opponent. And finally we have the Lightcone from the Battle Pass, Carve the Moon, Weave the Clouds, which has a persistent random effect where each turn your allies will either have an attack buff, a crit damage buff, or an energy regeneration buff. While I can't say I'm personally a fan of not having control of the buff I receive, the buffs are all helpful, especially as the crit damage and energy regen works well with Bronya's abilities. And to wrap things up with the 3-star Lightcones, starting with what I recommend, Meshing Cogs gives the user additional energy whenever they use an attack or get hit. And to S5, it gives a massive 8 energy per instance, which will give her ultimates. And lastly, we have Chorus, which will give your allies an attack boost. While choosing which Lightcone to get Bronya, keep in mind that Bronya's ultimate is somewhat expensive, costing 120 energy. As she's not really a unit that's often delivering the killing blow, her primary way of getting energy is by attacking and using your skill. Something to consider, although this 4-star Lightcone has better stats and is of higher rarity than this 3-star, the 3-star might be a better choice as it gives her the ER that she needs. But depending on the content that you're doing, your relic stats, and your playstyle, you should choose the Lightcone that works best for you. So moving on to some team building rotation tips, I'm going to talk about the general mindset you need to adopt while playing her, along with some example situations you might come across and some tips on how to build a Bronya team. In regards to Bronya's own rotations, it's best to think of her skill as costing 2 skill points. Because in most situations, you're going to be using your ally's skill right after, you'll end up running out of skill points if you're not careful. So to make up for this, it's ideal to have Bronya use her basic attack at least twice in a rotation to generate enough points to combo with her skill. Of course, it's important not to think of this in a vacuum, as other party members will also be using their basic attacks, when the situation allows it, to generate points. Also, it goes without saying that you should never tunnel on what's considered optimal for a character, as you're always going to be adjusting your decisions based on your resources and the turn stack. Speaking of paying attention to turn stack, in this example, since my enemies are all faster than my tank and there's no way I can break or kill all the enemies, I choose to use Dan Heng to build a skill point, and use Marching Bronya to get the Trailblazer ready to soak up all the damage, as using Bronya's basic attack would leave my whole party open to getting hit. In this next situation, I can see that the enemies are about to take their turn. Seeing that I have 2 skill points, I do have enough to combo Bronya's skill with Seirei to kill the enemy on the left, triggering her talent. However, doing so would leave me with 0 skill points after and only a basic attack left. And if I go for the guy on the right and doesn't kill, I would have wasted 2 skill points. Seeing that Seirei will be able to go for the enemy anyways, I will be patient and use Bronya's attack to build a skill point instead. Although there's probably a better solution to this problem, this is the kind of mindset that you should have when you're thinking about whether to attack or use skill with this character. Your decision making will be different from mine, but in general, as long as you plan ahead and not get too carried away with comboing, you'll do just fine. Now, in regards to team building, Bronya is incredibly flexible as she can be slotted into any team where she can accentuate the main DPS and bridge your slower characters. As a general rule for team building, I recommend having 1 main DPS and 1 shielder or healer on the team, with the last slot being up to your preference based on the content that you're doing. Because team building and starrail will vary based on what you're fighting, and because Bronya is a support, I personally recommend that instead of thinking about who's best on a Bronya team, you should rather think about how Bronya will benefit the DPS you want to use on your team. For example, because Hook can trigger burn status and does more damage to burn enemies, Bronya can help make that loop occur more often. Or because Dan Heng has a talent that gives him wind penetration when he's targeted by an ally's ability, you can use Bronya to help him nuke even harder. And finally, if you're lucky enough to pull for her, Seirei is an incredible character to pair with Bronya. Although both these characters are skill point hungry, because of Seirei's high speed stat and A6 passive, they both get early turns with their basic attacks, meaning that you can quickly generate an insane amount of resources just between the 2 of them before bursting the opponent down. Overall, I rate Bronya pretty high, as she's the only character in the game that can freely manipulate the turn stack. And as we approach the endgame in starrail, although we're nowhere near it now, I feel like she may end up being the most valuable support in the game with proper gearing. And to be honest, I'm not really sure who else I would have wanted from the starter supply. But that's really it from me. Let me know in the comments if there's anything about Bronya you'd like to mention, and if there's any other character you'd like to see a guide for. And with that, I'll see you next time.